Following on from the first video covering some of the most disturbing punishments throughout history, we have compiled another list of 7 of the worst torments and executions that have ever been concocted by the human race. Some were designed to extract information, some were designed to act as a macabre warning to others, and some were done for the sheer sadistic pleasure of it. In today's video, we will look again into the twisted world of creative punishments and executions. The Brazen Bull, otherwise known as the Bronze Bull, was a form of torture and execution that was reportedly used in ancient Greece. This device was shaped as a bull, completely hollow and made from bronze with a door at the top. The condemned victim was to be forced inside and the door locked. A fire was then lit underneath the bull, slowly heating up the metal until the person inside was cooked to death. It was reported that all that would be left would be the bones of the condemned, that was said to shine brightly as if they were jewels. It was even said that there were a series of tubes that would transform the victim's screams of pain into cries of an infuriated bull. The heat would also ignite a branch of herbs, spices, and incense. This was done to mask the scent of cooking human flesh. According to legend, a tyrant by the name of Phalaris ruled the Greek colony on Sicily with an iron fist. One of his favoured sculptors, named Perelius, designed and built the Brazen Bull to appease his master. Unfortunately for Perelius, he would become the first victim of the Brazen Bull, roasted alive in a contraption of his own making. But before the inventor perished, he was removed and instead thrown from a cliff. Perelius believed that he would earn the favour of his tyrannical master, though in the end, he gravely miscalculated. Whether he was killed because of Perelius' disgust at such a horrendous device, or because of his eagerness to try out his new toy, is not clear. The Brazen Bull would go on to be adapted by the Romans as a method of executing Christians, notable examples being Saint Eustace and Saint Antipas. It is hard to imagine how one would cope in such a claustrophobic space, knowing that the heat would only get worse, with no way safe from the blistering heat of the metal that would scorch your skin and slowly cook you alive. Number 2. The Iron Maiden. When one thinks of medieval torture devices, it's easy to immediately think of the Iron Maiden, a coffin-like device made of metal where a victim would be placed inside before the doors would be closed and locked, only that on the inside of the doors were a row of spikes that would impale a person. It is hard to picture a medieval dungeon or torture room without such a device, but you may be shocked to learn that evidence of such a device does not exist. For one, such a device would not be an effective torture implement. The length and the position of the spikes would need to be tailored for each victim so as to not cause immediate death from either going too deep or piercing vital organs. The emergence of the Iron Maiden as a torture device can be traced to the late 1700s. A German philosopher named Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote about the execution of a coin forger in the 1500s by an Iron Maiden that took place in the city of Nuremberg. What is more likely, however, is that this is both an exaggeration and conflation of various other tortures. First is the Schandmantel, or coat of shame in German. It was a form of public degradation, similar to stocks, where often a criminal would be locked inside for all to see. This could have been combined with the Iron Apega, an ancient Greek device used to extort money. It was formed in the likeness of a queen of Sparta that would hug the victim. As the arms closed, the victim would be crushed into the device, and the spikes that covered the arms, hands, and breasts would slowly pierce the skin, until the money was finally agreed to be paid. Whilst the Iron Maiden conjures images of the cruelty of medieval tortures, it is in all likelihood a fabrication, and one that is not needed at all, as there were truly depraved tortures employed that require no exaggeration at all. With number 3, the Japanese prisoners of war. During the Second World War, the Japanese Imperial Army was able to conquer vast swathes of the Pacific and mainland China. The speed of their assaults resulted in the capture of many prisoners of war, who were subject to some of the worst treatment imaginable. It was instilled into the Japanese soldiers that capture was a fate worse than death, and so to see the enemy forces willing to surrender when defeated often resulted in a response of utter disgust. Some prisoners, both of war and civilians, would find their way to become enslaved labour, trafficked, or subject to SA, and some would be used as human test subjects in twisted experiments. You can see our video on Unit 731 for those wishing to learn more about these twisted experiments, but for this section we will focus on the prisoners of war. Those soldiers unfortunate enough to be captured were often forced into labour under slave-like conditions, fueling Japan's war industry. Due to the starvation-like rations, poor treatment, and illnesses, as many as 40% of the prisoners of war would perish. Many large corporations in Japan would hire out the enslaved labour to work in factories, in coal mines, or chemical plants. In addition to the poor treatment, many prisoners of war were tortured in the bid to extract intelligence about the Allied forces. Aside from the usual extreme beatings, often preceded by having to stand in the blazing sun for hours, the Japanese interrogators favoured simulated drowning. Waterboarding was commonplace, that is, where a cloth would be placed over a victim's mouth and nose, and then water would be applied at full force onto the towel. The water would soak through, blocking the victim's mouth and nose. As they would gag and frantically gasp for breath, water would fill the throat. One infamous yet unconfirmed form of torture would involve bamboo. The quick-growing bamboo provided a way to slowly harm and eventually kill the prisoners of war. Imperial Japanese soldiers would tie down Allied prisoners over a bed of sharpened bamboo shoots. The bamboo would grow a few inches each day and was capable of penetrating human flesh. The various maltreatments of the prisoners of war by the Imperial Japanese Army could fill an entire video on their own, so if you are interested, please comment and let us know. Number 4. Impaling. One form of torture and execution that defies all comprehension is impaling. It involved the victim being penetrated by a stake or spear to varying degrees. It was often reserved for crimes deemed to be the most egregious, such as infanticide, treason, or betrayal. I can almost guarantee that many of you are already thinking of the man so fond of this torture and execution method that it even became his moniker, Vlad the Impaler. Such was his savagery, Vlad would go on to inspire the creation of Count Dracula. Dracula being a nickname derived from his father Vlad the Dragon, or Dracul. As you might imagine, impalement is a gruesome and drawn-out process that would result in death due to massive internal trauma and bleeding. The stake would be sharpened to a point and sometimes greased. The victim would then be placed over and lowered onto the spike. For men, it would be through the rectum, or for women, through the vagina. The stake or spear would protrude either through the victim's neck, through the throat, and then out of the mouth, or between their shoulders. It is estimated that Vlad the Impaler would order no less than 20,000 people to be impaled, the corpses of such victims often acting as an effective warning against any would-be invaders. Whilst Vlad is without a doubt impalement's most infamous practitioner, it was employed around the world in ancient empires of Persia and Assyria, and as recently as the 20th century during the Armenian genocide. Number 5. Keel Hauling. When one thinks of punishments associated with the maritime of old, you may think of walking the plank or being left on an island to starve to death. But one of the most violent execution or punishment methods employed against the sailors who were deemed deserving was keel hauling. The process first involved a sailor being stripped naked and tied up in a way so that they would not be able to swim. Weights would be dragged to their body, often chains or cannonballs, so that they would be submerged and dragged under. The final step was the victim being attached to 2 ropes, one from their back to one side of the main mast, and the second would be tied from the sailor through all the way under the ship to the other side of the main mast. Then the sailor would be dropped into the sea, the weight of the chains pulling him under, and once submerged, the rest of the crew would pull on the other rope, dragging the victim under the ship along the underside of the hull, before pulling him back up onto the deck. Where it is not enough that the victim would be at risk of drowning or a serious head injury, the underside of the boat would be without a doubt covered in razor-sharp barnacles or limpets that would shred the bare skin, exposing the torn flesh to the salty sea. The level of injury inflicted would depend on the speed in which the victim was pulled through the water. A faster speed would result in the victim remaining in contact with the hull throughout the underwater journey, causing massive damage and even decapitation. The practice has its origins with the ancient Greek navy, though it was employed by the British and Dutch navies at the height of their power. It is hard to imagine such a massive combination of trauma being inflicted at once, only to be brought aboard the ship with nowhere to go and surrounded by those who had carried out this barbaric punishment. Number 6. Immurement. I can imagine that many of you have at least thought about the traumatic experience of being buried alive. A different spin on this can be seen in the torture known as immurement, where victims would be enclosed in a small space for long periods of time, often until death. In many instances, a person would be enclosed behind a wall with bricks being laid trapping a person in a claustrophobic space. Whilst this was often used as a torture, it was not uncommon for religious people to voluntarily immure themselves. The practice can be seen as far back as ancient Rome, where Vestal virgins would be punished for breaking their chastity vows. Those who were caught would be stripped and then forced into a catacomb. Often she would be bricked behind a wall with enough food and water to last for a few days. The belief was that if she was forgiven by the goddess Vesta, she would be freed. As you can imagine, the supplies would run out and the woman would die a slow and excruciating death. Some Christian ascetics would voluntarily immure themselves in a tomb for years at a time, with the only window to the outside world being a small hole for the meager rations to be sent through. In Persia, the city walls were often built with a recess just large enough for a man to stand in. The condemned would be dragged into the cavity before it was sealed up with bricks. Gaps were left as to allow the entombed to breathe for a few days before dying. In Mongolia, as recent as 1914, a form of immurement was practiced with people locked in wooden crates. They would be suspended in a way that forced them into uncomfortable positions, often with their head and arms protruding. Any food or water that was given to them was just to prolong their suffering, as there would be no leaving the crate once immured. And finally, for number 7, Poinaculum. In ancient Rome, a particular form of capital punishment was developed for the crime of killing a parent. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack with a variety of live animals. It would include a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. The writhing mass of trapped creatures would then be thrown into a body of water where they would all drown. The Roman family was the fundamental basis for Roman society. The Romans considered the act of killing someone who gave life to you so abhorrent and capable of fragmenting society itself. The punishment, therefore, had to be severe enough to reflect this belief. The process of Poinaculum would first start with the condemned being whipped before their head was covered with a bag. Heavy wooden shoes were then worn to help drag the victim down into the water, before finally being interned into the sack full of animals. The Roman law prescribing this method of execution was very particular, almost ritualistic. It specified the materials used for the bags and the types of implements used to flog the guilty. This method would have been rarely used, save for extreme cases, and would fall out of favour to be replaced with immolation. Whilst there have been a myriad of tortures and executions employed throughout human history, what unites them all is the uniquely human propensity for imaginative cruelty. The number of creative methods of inflicting pain and suffering is something that unfortunately unites all nations and peoples.